Alright, this is Mark Devlin. Welcome to the Q&A session that I announced a few weeks back that I wanted to do. Now, I'm not the world's most technically competent guy, as I may have mentioned in the past, so I'm not really up technically to doing a live Q&A session on Facebook. I hope to do that in the near future, but to kind of ease myself into it, I figured I would pre-record this one and put it out on YouTube and Facebook and ease myself into it that way. I'm not really much of a one for doing videos. I prefer to do radio shows and podcasts and stuff. There's a reason why I got into radio and not TV, but I thought it would be a good thing to interact with people in this way. And a lot of folk have got in touch with questions since I announced that I will be doing this a few weeks back. So what I'm going to do is run through many of those and give my responses to a fair few of them. So got a few notes here. I am old school like that, so I've got my clipboard with some paper notes and stuff. I'll be running through them that way. All right, so let's get into it. The first one is coming from Frode Hagen, aka Frost Hound from Norway. And he got in touch to say, "Hey Mark, do you think they're in a hurry to bring on the New World Order because people are waking up, or what do you think? Was thinking on the wildfires in the States, etc. And one more question, what can I read to study natural law in depth? I've just read the Kybalion." All right, so the first part of that, it certainly feels like the controllers are throwing everything they've got at us all at once. We're being assaulted on many levels, from chemtrails to vaccines to the smart grid Internet of Things that's coming in, to 5G communication technology, to the dangers of fracking, to all the symbolic and satanic stuff that's coming through entertainment, through the debasement of morals that's happening that way, the breakup of the family unit, the transgender agenda, all this stuff. It's all coming at once, thick and fast. So you could certainly be forgiven for thinking that those that are controlling these things are panicking to a very large degree, and they want to lock us down as much as possible, as quickly as possible. At the same time, we've got this other dynamic happening. It's a kind of dialectic. So you've got people waking up in ever larger numbers and getting wise to the agenda and what's going on, not least through all the information that's now being put out by the large number of researchers out there and citizen researchers, as well as the well-established big name ones. So it's become something of a race between whether enough people, a critical mass, are going to get wise to what's going on and start taking action, because it's one thing to understand what's happening in the world, it's another thing to actually get involved in placing obstacles in the path of this agenda and making it difficult for it to progress and resisting in whatever way you can, versus whether the prison door is going to get slammed fully shut before we get a chance to jam a foot in it and prevent that from happening. So it's anybody's guess as to how things can play out. We live in a reality where all possibility is waiting to come into physical manifestation. So we could find ourselves in a generation or two in the nightmare dystopian state predicted by the likes of Orwell and Aldous Huxley, where humanity is basically locked down to such a degree that our lives aren't really worth living because it's not life as it was meant to be lived. Or humanity could rise up in its large numbers and finally take back its power and its freedom and recognise that we are actually in control of what happens in this reality. So obviously I hope the latter is going to be the case, but I guess we're just going to have to wait and see. And there's some very interesting times ahead in the months to come, I would suggest. In terms of where to go for good information on natural law, I'm going to say the work of Mark Passio, because I've learned so much from that. I know he has his detractors. Every prominent researcher in this game does, and has been accused of being a shill, an insider, a Satanist, a Freemason. I get that myself. So there's going to be people that say you shouldn't be looking at his work, but in all honesty, as far as I'm concerned, and in terms of my own comprehensions of the way universal law works and these different spiritual dynamics, look at the work of Mark Passio. He's got his seminar on natural law on YouTube, which is like 7 or 8 hours long, something like that. Really good starting point. Plus the podcast series that you would find at whatonearthishappening.com. All that information has been tremendously useful for me, and it's kicked my ass into action in a very big way as well. So I think others will get something out of that. The Kybalion, as I understand, is another good option. This guy says he's already read that. And also look out for my forthcoming novel. So a project I want to get onto very soon is a book that I'm going to be calling The Cause and the Cure. And it's basically fiction. It's me trying my hand at that for the first time. It's going to be a book set in Oxford in 1990. So it's going to be full of period detail. That was a very interesting time, and there's lots of stuff to get into there. But underlying the surface narrative, which is going to be that of a crime thriller, it's going to be, you know, a serial killer running around Oxford. But there's going to be so much more to it, because it's going to be laden with allegory and metaphors relating to natural law spiritual teachings. I hope to get that out sometime in 2019. So it just depends how quickly I can get around to it. All right, so moving on to a question coming from Eileen Sweeney of Braintree, not Braintree in Essex, but Braintree in Massachusetts in the USA. I didn't know there was one, but they seem to steal all our town names, right? Only kidding. So thanks to Eileen for getting in touch. She asks, might you have any info on U2's rise to stardom, the group U2, and specifically Bono? Well, I've never found anything on Bono to prove that he comes from one of these significant bloodlines, or that he has ties to Freemasonry or any other secret societies. But it's pretty obvious when you look at the cast of characters that he hangs around with, all these US presidents, all these New World Order oligarchs, the Pope and all these people, that he's been elevated to the upper ranks of the music industry elites. He's a key player. I suspect this was down to U2 having been watched very early on in their career, and it having been noted that they had great talent and great potential to influence large numbers of people. And as a result of that, they were approached and they were made an offer to step a few rungs up the control system ladder and become, you know, these key players that they are, specifically in the case of Bono. And I think he's shown himself to be someone that's absolutely down with the New World Order agenda and is prepared to do whatever it takes to further his own career and further his own status. In the process, I would suggest that he's lost his soul and he's degraded his humanity in a way that is pretty devastating, and he's not going to be getting that back anytime soon. But that is my perception of what happened with U2 and specifically Bono. So they started out making these inspiring, motivational songs like Sunday Bloody Sunday and Pride in the Name of Love. But as the years progressed, it became very, very clear that they were key stooges and puppets and players in this whole mind control agenda for which the music industry is used. So she asks about Oasis's popularity. And I would say it's pretty much more of the above. They've struck me also as a group that's been elevated to a strong position as a result of being prepared to do whatever's required of them. There is an interesting pic of Liam Gallagher with Jimmy Savile, which you can get online. I've featured this in some of my public talks. And Liam is flashing up the old devil horns sign, this familiar symbol that we see all over the place, and he's sat there with Savile, who's got his, you know, demonic tinted red glasses on. So that takes a bit of explaining away, I would suggest. Of course, Noel Gallagher was a part of the whole Cool Britannia bollocks, which was designed to popularise Tony Blair and his new Labour Party among the youthful generation of the mid-90s, in line with that whole Britpop thing, which was Oasis versus Blur, primarily. So both those groups would have been down with that agenda, I would suggest, and would have been knowing puppets within the whole thing. There's also the issue of Liam Gallagher being the third of 4 music industry husbands of Patsy Kensit, who becomes an interesting character to study. So she was a child star. She appeared in Bird's Eye Peas commercials. Some older viewers from the UK might recall those in the 1970s. Her family was very much connected to gangland crime in London. They've got connections going into the Cray twins. Her dad was a well-known criminal in the East End underworld. And so Patsy went on to become the wife of Dan Donovan of Big Audio Dynamite, followed by Jim Kerr of Simple Minds, followed by Liam Gallagher of Oasis, followed by Jeremy Healy of Hazy Fantasy, who also became a big club DJ in the 90s. So she seems to have been passed around the industry like a rag doll from person to person. And it very much smacks of her being somebody who has undergone mind control programming. This ties into beta programming, which is all about the blonde bombshell look, sex kitten programming. Look at the work of Vigilant Citizen for more on this, and I've mentioned this in some of my talks. And I'm sure that what happens a lot in the industry is that you get arranged relationships and arranged marriages. So where you see two celebrities coming together in a couple, Beyonce and Jay-Z spring to mind, Kanye West and Kim Kardashian, this whole thing is orchestrated and put into place, versus these individuals just happening to fall hopelessly romantically in love with each other. So I think probably we saw that with Patsy Kensit. I'm speculating, of course. She had her own career briefly as a singer with Eighth Wonder, but she very much fit that whole blonde bombshell archetype. And it seems very interesting to me that she was passed around all these characters in the industry and got divorced from all of them. So it's all a bit of a mess, but you know, there's some implication for Liam from Oasis in that whole thing. Okay, so Eileen goes on to ask about Tori Amos. She says she always creeped me the fuck out. I'd be inclined to agree. I don't have anything specific on her, but yeah, there's some stuff going on there for sure. Nine Inch Nails, not really a group I've looked into. I'm sure there's stuff there to be found. One day I'm sure I will. The Sex Pistols. All right, so Malcolm Mclaren, the manager of the Sex Pistols, many of his activities always skirted around the edges of paedophilia. So I mentioned this in Musical Truth Volume 2. He published a magazine, like a music fashion magazine, for a short period, which he titled Chicken. And chicken is interesting terminology when you get into the whole Pizzagate affair and some of the terms that have been identified by the FBI by which paedophiles refer to young kids that are passed around among them. They have these food-related terms like pizza, hot dog, chicken. It's all very sick. So why did Mclaren choose to name his magazine Chicken? There's a photograph of him with the slogan Cambridge Rapist on his t-shirt. There's this instance with Maurice Oberstein, who was the president of the British phonographic industry for a time. There's an anecdote I relate in my book where Oberstein was allegedly caught with a young boy getting up to no good, and Malcolm Mclaren is said to have exploited that whole situation for his own gain, to be controversial. There's the situation with Mclaren putting Annabella Lewin of Bow Wow Wow on the cover of a record sleeve naked when she was 13 years old. So Mclaren certainly seems to have these connections with the sordid side of the industry. He also was acquainted with Afrika Bambaataa, the hip-hop founding father, who's been exposed quite recently as a predatory paedophile by a number of people. So, of course, Mclaren was the brains, effectively, and the creative force behind the Sex Pistols and their rise to fame. So that's a bit suspicious in the first regard. Then we have Johnny Rotten, aka John Lydon. First of all, at the final Sex Pistols concert in San Francisco in January 1978, at the very end of the show, he famously got up on stage and said, "Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Good night." So it's kind of an admission from Johnny Rotten that that whole group was a construct. It was set up to have an effect on culture. It was created to bring in the whole punk and new wave movement, which lasted several years and was very influential. And the Sex Pistols would appear to have been a group that was manufactured for that purpose. We also have the great rock and roll Swindle, the movie about the Sex Pistols' rise to fame, which was spearheaded by Malcolm Mclaren, and it's right there in the title, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle. Are they telling you what it was all about? The unexplained deaths of Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen, of course, have to raise some scrutiny. And there's the connection to the very strange venue, the Chelsea Hotel in New York, which would appear to have been some kind of mind control programming location. I mentioned this in Musical Truth Volume 2, and the huge number of celebrities and public figures that took up residence in the Chelsea Hotel at some period or other. There's strange deaths connected to the place, there's allegations of satanic rituals going on, and there's suspicion of mind control activity as well. So Sid Vicious was connected to that place, which was made famous in the movie by Alex Cox, of course, Sid and Nancy. Now, back to Johnny Rotten, John Lydon. There's an article that appeared in the Daily Mail in October of 2014, if I just consult my clipboard here. Let me just read a part of this article. Shortly before he became punk's most notorious star, Johnny Rotten attended late-night drinking sessions at the House of Commons and witnessed MPs mingling with working girls. He's revealed in a new book that he attended late-night drinking sessions at the House of Commons. Lydon says, "There we were, looking out at the Thames under a brolly, the Houses of Parliament overshadowing us, surrounded by all of these MPs who all day seem to squabble and hate each other, but there they were, discussing who's going with what escort." Lydon had yet to become a household name as Johnny Rotten, and he thinks many of the assembled MPs would have mistaken him for a male escort. He says, "I suppose they thought I was a male prostitute with a slightly different way of dressing." A question becomes, what was Johnny Rotten doing in the House of Commons in the first place? How did he get access? How did he become involved in that whole thing? And is it just coincidence that a short while after that, he crops up as the lead singer of this hugely influential group that changed popular culture of the time? I would suspect there is no coincidence in these matters. So there's something to muse and mull over. All right, the final group that Eileen asked about is Joy Division. She says, especially the suicide of Ian Curtis, as we couldn't get a straight story from Tony Wilson, the manager of the band. Well, absolutely. So Ian Curtis is one of a high number of musicians who is said to have suffered from bipolar disorder. This is a very common thing among artists. We get reports of Adam Ant having been bipolar. Also Sinead O'Connor, Dolores O'Riordan of the Cranberries, who died in January this year. And we've just had the very interesting coroner's report stating that she died in the bathtub of her hotel room. But don't worry, there's no foul play or suspicion here, according to the police. Just one of those things. Happens all the time, right? Especially if you've been bipolar. That's the implication. Mariah Carey has also come out recently stating that she's been bipolar for a long period. So mental disorders really seem to be a thing among many of these artists. And of course, with this, we start lapping at the fringes of mind control, trauma-based mind control programming, which is known to be absolutely endemic throughout the music industry. So Tony Wilson was a stated situationist. Situationism was this kind of highbrow intellectual political cultural movement which is said to have come out of France in the 1960s. It very much influenced the beat poets, it very much influenced the counterculture, the kind of hippie scene, and it was very much embraced by the punk and new wave movement of the UK. So among other situationists were the aforementioned Malcolm Mclaren, Bernie Rhodes, the manager of The Clash, who is said to have introduced Johnny Rotten, John Lydon to Malcolm Mclaren, and Bill Drummond of the KLF and the Jams, Justified Ancients of Moo Moo, that group that emerged during the rave era. Bill Drummond and Jimmy Cauty, very interesting, extremely bizarre characters and situationists. So Tony Wilson was tied to that whole thing as well, this sort of intellectual movement. So you have to ask yourself whether there are elements of a cult type situation going on there and secret society type leanings. And of course, Tony Wilson had mainstream media connections through Granada TV. So anyone that does get a platform on a mainstream media outlet like that, you have to kind of ask yourself whether they might be serving some agenda or other versus having earned that position through hard work and good luck. And Tony Wilson died at a relatively young age, in his 50s, I think, of some medical situation, way before what you would have expected to have been his time. So there's a few red flags and anomalies there when it comes to Joy Division, New Order, and Tony Wilson. Thanks again to Eileen for that question. It was a long one, but we got there in the end. On to the next one, which is a bit briefer, coming from Mark Blanchflower in Australia. I love the fact that these have come in from all over the world. This is great. So he asks, At what level are the people running the music business studying astrology and earth cycles to predetermine when to create a new music scene to hinder the effects that these energies will have on the generation group they wish to affect? Well, that's a very good question. I'm not really sure to which degree the controllers observe astrology and all these other phenomena, but there are a couple of instances of stories related in my book which come to mind here, which I want to relate to try and answer the question. The first one is an excerpt from the Conspiro Media blog from my good friend Matt Sergio. And this is related to the famous Rolling Stones gig in December 1969 at Altamont, which turned into a snuff film, basically. There was this young lad, Meredith Hunter, along with some others, who were killed, stabbed up by a bunch of Hell's Angels while the Rolling Stones were performing at this gig. And the whole thing was reportedly captured on film by a young upcoming movie maker by the name of George Lucas. You might have heard of him. Anyway, the whole vibe at this Rolling Stones event is said to have been very dark and very foreboding. And there were a number of people that were present that questioned the timing of why it was that this event was put on when it was, in December 69. One of the people raising these concerns was Grace Slick of the group Jefferson Airplane, who were also on the bill. According to this Conspiro Media blog then, Grace Slick is said to have picked up on the strange vibrations of that day, recalling that the vibes were bad. Something was very peculiar. Not particularly bad, just really peculiar. She says, I'd expected the loving vibe of Woodstock, but that wasn't coming at me. This was a whole different thing. The magazine Rolling Stone, in a special Altamont issue published shortly after the event, reported that a chick towards the front of the stage on the opening day of the festival was telling her old man, it's weird, they consulted the astrologers before setting the dates for Woodstock, but they couldn't have consulted an astrologer about today. Anyone can see that with the moon in Scorpio, today's an awful day to do this concert. There's a strong possibility of violence and chaos, and any astrologer could have told him this. Then there's a separate reference in Musical Truth 2, which kind of speaks to this whole idea of timings connected with phenomena taking place in the cosmos and all that stuff. This one is related to the UK acid house scene and the familiar myth that we get of how that whole thing got started in 1987, paving the way for the rave scene and then laying the foundations for the worldwide electronic dance music scene that we have today. So this comes from an interview with Danny Rampling, who is universally credited with having been one of the pioneering forces behind the UK acid house scene and how it all got started. I do doubt whether that story of Paul Oakenfold and Rampling and a couple of their mates going to Ibiza on holiday in August 1987, having this amazing spiritual epiphany and then bringing the whole thing back to the UK and creating an entire worldwide cultural scene and youth movement in the process. I do have my doubts over how accurate that is and how over-embellished that story has become over the decades. But nevertheless, in reference to it, Danny Rampling was interviewed by The Guardian in 2007 on the 20th anniversary of that fateful trip to Ibiza. And he's talking about what it led to. A quote from him reads, "I'll bring something different to the table here. I felt there was something deeper spiritually running through the whole experience. I discovered something recently through my own research. In August 1987, there was an event called the Harmonic Convergence, a global, his words, shift in unity consciousness through dance rituals, which is part of the Maya calendar teachings." Then in the book, I go on to say, though questions remain among genuine seekers about the true cosmology of the place in which we live, they certainly do, the Grand Trine is said to reflect a rare alignment of 8 planets, which according to astrologer Neil Mickelson's The American Ephemeris, occurred on the 24th of August 1987, placing it even closer to the 4 London DJs' fabled visit to Ibiza, which is always said to have been in late August of 87 for Paul Oakenfold's birthday. Was this all purely coincidental and ultimately meaningless, or were Rampling and his friends unwittingly tapping into a consciousness shift that was occurring at the time? According to researchers, 87's Harmonic Convergence marked a 25-year lead-in to December 2012 and the end of the Yuga cycle measured by the famous Mayan calendar system. In many ways, of course, December 2012 turned out to be a huge letdown, and we had all these prophecies about what the 21st of December 2012 was going to bring in terms of major shifts in consciousness. It's open to argument as to whether that actually occurred or not, but it becomes interesting that this event seems to have been tied into it 25 years earlier, according to these ideas. I hope that answers the question anyway. There's a couple of stories there related to these consciousness shifts and planetary alignments and stuff like that. All right, so on to the next one. This is coming from Nigel Pinnock, who got in touch on Facebook. And he said, I would like it very much if you could talk about the state of music in the UK at the moment. Must I? And why all the male kiddie artists look like they've just taken time out from their office jobs at Barclays to cut a record. Absolutely. Then he goes on to ask, in your profession as a DJ, on discovering the information you talk of now, did you look at those in the business who were close to you in a different light? For example, did you try waking up some of your buddies in the business, or were you cautious as to who you discussed certain groups in the business with? Okay, addressing the first part of that then, I would have to say that any kind of individual style or creativity in the music scene coming out of the UK, or anywhere else for that matter now, seems to have been completely stifled and just disintegrated, just put out of being. Whereas in the past, you had all these different scenes and movements. You can think of the new romantic scene of the 80s, for instance. You can think of punk and new wave. You can think of grunge, heavy metal, heavy rock. You can think of drum and bass, acid house, even the early UK garage scene. All these different movements and the acts that came out of them at least had a kind of fashion, an ethos, a look, a cultural way of going about things, iconography, imagery connected to that scene, which you could argue it was all contrived. You could argue it was all put there for purposes of controlling culture and having a psychological subliminal effect on the consumers and all that sort of thing. But at least there was an element of creativity going on. At least it felt like these artists were expressing themselves in some way, artistically. What we have now is just a bunch of puppets and clones and stooges that are just rolled off a conveyor belt, it would seem, in a factory and churned out to the public. No one group is discernible from any other. No female pop puppet singer is discernible from any of her peers. All the individuality has just been completely stripped away. They're really doing a job on this generation known as the millennials, you know, because this is the music and the culture that's been served up to that age group that were born round about the time that the 1990s gave way to the 2000s. And this is what they've got to mark their youthful years, their formative time of life. In decades to come, they're going to look back on their teens and their 20s, and the music, so-called, that we have at the moment is going to have been the soundtrack to all of that. So what a bloody tragedy that is. Pity anyone that has got this to stand as the soundtrack to their youth. I just want to get into part of a rant on YouTube by Paul Joseph Watson, who comes out of the InfoWars camp. Now, I certainly don't place a lot of stock in much of what this guy says, and I'm no fan of his by any stretch of the imagination, nor am I a fan of InfoWars. But every now and again, somebody of that ilk does come with some insights that are absolutely on point, and they do absolutely nail it. And so it was with a video that Paul Joseph Watson put out called The Truth About Popular Music. I just want to read an excerpt of it here. I featured this in my book also because I think it really makes the point. He said, The music industry is now largely controlled by a handful of mercenaries who have strangled originality and replaced it with predictive algorithms. Virtually everyone you see is little more than a programmed robot, spewing out noises that a computer has decided on beforehand. That's why everything is so fucking sterile. That's why there's nothing subversive about music anymore. Because whereas musicians used to be interesting people and have actual personalities, and that's where the authenticity of the music came from, now they're more akin to hand-picked Stepford wives. Absolutely. And I go on to say, yes, I've had to view others in the industry differently since waking up, and particularly other DJs. So I've got my questions about any DJs that are still peddling the god-awful, toxic garbage and shite that passes for urban music in 2018. So that's my background, of course. As a DJ, I used to play hip-hop, R&B, reggae dancehall, these other forms of urban black music. And I did that until a few years ago, where I just decided I could no longer be a part of that. The music had become so turgid and so satanic and so toxic that I wanted no part in it and didn't want to put my name to it. So I have to have some questions about those DJs that are still playing this stuff after having been in the game for as long as I have, 20 odd years. They remember better times. They know that the music didn't always used to be like this. They would have been out there playing music in the clubs and on the radio 15, 20 years ago of a much higher quality than what we now have. So, of course, you could make the argument that this is what they do for a living. They don't want to have to find a new career, and so they're just going along to get along. And although they realise that the music has become utterly debased and is shit, they're playing it just because they need to continue making a living. Yeah, that's one argument. But I would have thought that there would have been some other high-profile radio and club DJs who would have got out of the game, having seen what the music scene has now become, and started voicing their concerns over, the way things now are. And yet I've not seen that. I've really not seen that with any significant names coming out and raising awareness of this stuff. So I wonder why that is. And I wonder how many of these people are, industry players that are serving the agenda, whether knowingly and willingly, or whether as, dupes and pawns of that system. So I've got some questions about that. There are very few DJs that I came up in the game with, that I used to associate with, that have told me that they've got out because they can't stand what it's become, or they can now see the mind control agenda at play. So that's a little disappointing, but I guess it's understandable on many levels. What else did I want to say about that? Yeah, just really that I had to get out. Couldn't be a part of that any longer, and I've got no regrets about making that decision. It was definitely the right thing to do. All right, so on to the next one. Rick Woods got in touch, and he is asking, have you seen the video for Stand by REM? And what are your thoughts on the video and Michael Stipe? Right, so this song is from 2009. I wasn't familiar with it until he raised the question, and I went and had a look at it on YouTube, and, well, yeah, it's a globe challenger, isn't it? This song is coming out with lyrics like, listen to reason, reason is calling, urging you to trust your senses. It says, think about direction, wonder why you have it. Think about the place where you live, wonder why you haven't before. So these lyrics are entirely consistent with somebody starting to question the true nature of this earth on which we live, and starting to question whether it is a spinning ball hurtling through the infinite vacuum of space in 4 different directions all at once, with the number 666 encoded into many of these calculations, or whether in fact things are just as they appear to us if we do, as the song says, trust our senses. What we perceive with our senses, with which we've been gifted by the Creator, what we perceive is stillness and a flat, motionless plane. That's what it comes down to. I know many people are going to hate on this. I know I'm going to get a lot of opposition and a lot of accusations through making this statement, but it is what it is. And I came to this comprehension myself 2 or 3 years ago, that everything we're told through mainstream, governmental and media sources is a lie. A systematic lie, served up to us all through our lives. Why would the true nature of the place in which we live be any different? Why would the forces that control us lie to us about everything, but suddenly tell us the truth when it comes to cosmology? So I think it's very interesting that this song and this video, Stand by REM, certainly seems to be questioning the spinning ball globe model that we're fed from childhood, and seems to be inviting people to trust their senses and actually have a good hard look at what we see and what we feel. Michael Stipe is another musician who comes from a military family background. Apparently his dad was involved in flying helicopters in Vietnam. And the group REM, I've never been one for their music. I can't stand the guy's whiny voice. Never really been a fan. But certainly, now that I've had a chance to research some of their music, their songs do seem to put out some truthful aspects of what's really going on in the world. They did have the song Man in the Moon, where they come with the lyric, if you believe they put a man in the moon, which of course they didn't, because the Apollo moon landings were a hoax. Total bullshit, as anyone with 2 eyes in their head and a mind to think can see. They also came with the song Orange Crush, talking about Agent Orange, the use of biological weaponry in Vietnam. So they seem to be a group that gives us these little nuggets of truth, but I would not suggest that they're necessarily on the side of the people, as some suggest, and that they're out to help us because they care about us and they want to uplift all humanity. I see that group, particularly given the military family connections, which we find in so many other bands, as giving us elements of the truth in plain sight, adhering to this tenet that we have coming through the occult controllers of having to let us know what they're doing and giving us an opportunity to know. It's referred to as revelation of the method. So you get these little nuggets of truth embedded in their work, but they'll often come with other statements which very much toe the official establishment line on things and reinforce mainstream ways of thinking. It becomes a real dichotomy, it becomes a real headfuck to try and get your mind around it. We see this with so many groups. I've mentioned Killing Joke recently. We get the same dynamic coming through them. So I would say that when it comes to that song Stand, it is an example of them giving us some truth, but it's surrounded by and padded out with a whole load of mystery, disinformation, misinformation, and just straight confusion, as it is with so many of these groups. And Rick goes on to ask, are we now scraping the bottom of the music barrel with Nicki Minaj and such, and is there hope that the only way now is up and possible improvement? I wish that was the case, mate, and I wish I could believe that we're on our way to better things in terms of messages communicated through mainstream music. I've learned that every time you think they've scraped the very bottom of the barrel in terms of debasing morals, you can think of Miley Cyrus, for instance, dressed up as a baby with a pacifier, simulating masturbation on stage. And you could think, really? Can things sink any lower than this? But they always find new ways of degrading things even further. So sorry to say, I think we've got a little bit more to go on that front. Our challenge, of course, becomes keeping our kids away from this toxic mind control and these subversive influences, which is a challenge for any parent of young kids to really step up to the mark and do what they need to do. All right, so on to the next one. This comes from the user known as Thought Criminal, who emailed to say, I have a question for your upcoming Q&A session. I was very glad to hear you mention Kay Reno in your interview with Jeff Berwick on the Anarchast podcast. I'm now curious if you're familiar with some of my other favourite conscious conspiracy rappers like Payday Monsanto, Illuminati Congo, Wake Self, Gift of Gab, Locksmith, Beast 1333. Rappers like Payday Monsanto and Illuminati Congo are wealths of knowledge. I'd love to hear you interview them. Well, absolutely. I'm familiar with some of these names. Beast 1333 put out a great record a few years ago, getting into the true occult origins of Christmas, Saturnalia, the winter solstice. That's a really good one. I tend to drag that out each year at Christmas as an alternative to Slade and Cliff Richard, get some Christmas truth out there. Payday Monsanto guests on Elias Clay's Heavy Kool-Aid, which is a classic piece of truth hip-hop that I drop in every conscious gig that I do. So I'm loving Payday's stuff. Not so familiar with some of these other names. I would love to hear some of their output, so if you want to send me some of their tunes, I'll gladly take a listen. K Reno is the truth. I love that dude's music. That is a true example of a real artist, just putting inspiring, uplifting messages out there and using the whole genre of music in exactly the same way it should be used for. I've been trying to secure an interview with K Reno for the longest time. I've reached out to him on many occasions, and we've actually had dates in the diary where we were due to speak, but for whatever reason, it never happens. So I've kind of given up on that one, though I would still love to interview that dude if the opportunity ever arose again. Some of the other conscious hip-hop MCs that I'm digging and who I have interviewed include Diesel Automatic, who is out of Montenegro in the Balkans, and he puts out a phenomenal amount of input. He's the truth as well. Elias Clay, who I previously mentioned, female MC, coming out of Colorado, love her stuff. Kale Sampson, he's an artist coming out of Toronto, Canada. He's not done much recently, but he put an album out in 2014, which is just straight real talk. And entry-level material as well, stuff that anyone can understand. You don't have to be a big fan of hip-hop. You can be new to this whole arena of truth research, and you'll gain a lot from listening to Kale Sampson's first album and only album. And there's a dude called MC Swayze in the UK as well, who I've interviewed, loving what he's all about. So I think it would be completely awesome to have a concert consisting of all of these conscious rappers. Can you imagine? A whole day where you just get conscious MC after conscious MC step into the stage and just putting bare truth out there in their own individual creative manner. I would love to see a concert like that happening. I would love to curate it. I would love to host it. I would love to be a conscious DJ playing tunes in between these acts. It would be nice to think that that could happen on some occasion or other. In the meantime, the archive of my Sound of Freedom conscious music podcast features many of the names I've just mentioned and a whole load of others, just putting out straight, truthful music, old and new. So if anyone's not familiar with that, look for the Sound of Freedom on Spreaker. I'm up to 86 shows now, and as far as I can make out, there's nothing else like this on the internet. There's no other showcase that brings together all these artists and the sort of things that they talk about in their records. So do check out the Sound of Freedom. All right, so next is going to be, consult the old clipboard again, being the Luddite that I am. This is Castle Landscapes. All right, so it's Ian at Castle Landscapes, which is all the information that I have on the sender of the question. But he says, sometimes I think that like everything else where money can be made, the truth scene is full of opportunists cashing in when they see an opening. And I've been conned, but I've been too programmed like everyone else to see it on so many occasions. So he says, my question is, who is the person or persons you looked up to in the truth scene that you found out to be a phony? So I think he's probably heard me make reference in some of my podcast interviews to the fact that when it comes to lifetime actors and having personal heroes and gurus that you place up on a pedestal, the truth consciousness scene, conspiracy scene, is no different to every other walk of life, in that a certain number of the prominent players that you get served up to you in that scene are going to be not what they would appear to be, and representing other interests, not the real deal, not genuine, in other words. Unfortunately, this does turn out to be the case in the so-called truth scene. So there's a handful about whom I have my suspicions, but I'm not going to name them here because I would want to have some kind of tangible proof or verifiable evidence that they're not all they're cracked up to be. And in the absence of being able to prove that they're not who we thought they were, I don't want to put their names out there. So I'm not going to do that, but there are 4 or 5 rather high-profile names that I have my suspicions about. And if I get to the point where I can prove beyond any reasonable doubt that they're not what they claim to be, I will put it out there. Names that I am happy to mention, though, would be Alex Jones. Okay, I don't think that will be a big surprise to a lot of people. He's a blatant gatekeeper. I think there's enough evidence out there to prove that, to a very large extent, he's putting fear out there. He's disempowering people. He's not offering solutions. He's adopted many questionable political stances. The late, great Bill Cooper, Milton William Cooper, warned everyone about Alex Jones back in the late 90s, that he's not to be trusted, before Bill Cooper was taken out in November of 2001 and removed from the scene. So I guess that tells you a lot. There's Charlie Veitch, who used to be a part of this organisation that he termed the Love Police. He used to make these YouTube videos. He used to go out on demonstrations and bellow through bullhorns at corporate HQs and political gatherings and things like that. And he would have you believe that he's someone who's representing conscientious truth seekers. It all went pear-shaped, of course, when Charlie Veitch appeared on the BBC television programme 9/11 Road Trip, which reinforced the official version of what happened on September 11th, 2001, and Charlie Veitch, who had previously been thought of as a truther, came out on that show saying, "Oh, well, I've listened to all the evidence from all these experts, and I can now see that 9/11 actually happened exactly the way we were told by the mainstream media, so I've changed my stance on it." No one who has researched 9/11 for more than about 2 minutes would genuinely go back to the official narrative once they've had access to all the information that shows it cannot possibly have happened the way we were told it did through the mainstream. So the fact that Charlie Veitch did a flip-flop 180-degree about turn shows his true nature. And in actual fact, he's an actor. He's got a profile online. I think he's on the IMDb database, and there's his resume of all the different projects that he's been seen acting in. So it would appear the whole Love Police thing, the whole Revolution of Consciousness thing, reminds you of Russell Brand, right? Was just a construct and was an act. So we have David Wilcock, who is a guy that's come with many predictions and prophecies and promises that, don't worry folks, we don't actually have to do anything. We can sit tight because the cavalry is about to arrive. There's going to be mass arrests of all these elites, all these paedophiles. It's coming very soon. I seem to recall an interview with him on Red Ice Radio back in, must have been about 2012, where he was talking about these triad gangsters, this coalition of triads from China that was going to be knocking on the door of all these elite paedophiles and oligarchs and arresting them and throwing them in jail. And none of us have to worry because this is all going to be done on our behalf and everything's going to be fine after that. Well, still waiting for that one, actually. And we're still waiting for all the subsequent claims from David Wilcock that help is just around the corner. This, of course, is disempowerment. It's coercing conscientious onlookers to just not do anything. Don't bother undertaking any kind of activism because everything's going to be okay. These people have got your back. We've seen more of that with the whole QAnon thing recently, where we're entrained to think that Q's got our back and don't worry because he's going to sort everything out. So I think that all speaks for itself, really. I've mentioned before. What else can I say? Who else am I going to mention? All right, I'm going to mention Jordan Maxwell. This guy is universally hailed as a kind of granddaddy of occult secret society research. But it is the case that Jordan Maxwell is a made-up name. His real name is Russell Pine, it would appear. And according to many researchers, he's got a track record of being a con man and a deceiver. A lot of researchers say that his claim that he's been into occult research and he's been putting it out there one way or another since the late 1950s is actually a gross exaggeration. And in fact, you can only trace his output back to the 1990s. You can only prove that he's been releasing this information for the past 20 odd years. There is actually no record of him having any kind of output from the 1960s, 70s, 80s. Now, the name Jordan Maxwell would appear to have been taken from a character by the name of Jordanus Maximus, who appeared in one of the Theosophy writings of Alice Bailey. And Theosophy has been adopted as kind of the occult doctrine, the religious belief system of the United Nations. And there's many other affiliations with the Theosophical movement as well, going back to the work of Madame Helena Blavatsky. So this is all, concerning stuff, I guess. I'm actually quite wary of anyone that uses a fake name in this business, high-profile researchers. We're supposed to be all about truth. We're supposed to be all about transparency. And yet you find that a lot of prominent researchers hide behind some kind of assumed name rather than letting you know who they really are. Why the secrecy? Similarly, Michael Tessarion, who is often mentioned in the same breath as Jordan Maxwell, his real name turns out to be Brian Heatley. I've been informed just recently that Fritz Springmeier is a completely made-up name as well, and his real name would appear to be Victor Earl Schoof. So I now have some questions about how genuine that guy is, and all the work that he's put out, such as Bloodlines of the Illuminati and his work into trauma-based mind control. It's pretty devastating when people that you previously placed some faith in appear to be not what you thought they were. Why all these fake names? Why all these manufactured backgrounds? Why all these dubious histories? Why are we not being open if there's nothing to hide? Then we come on to Dallas Goldbug, aka Ed Shiriani. He's the guy that puts out all these theories that public figures and certain prominent truth researchers are actually other famous people, celebrities, truth researchers that have been recycled and have come out with new identities. So it's through Dallas Goldbug we get the idea that David Icke and Richard Branson are actually the same person. It's an actor playing these different roles. Presumably the beard gets stuck on from time to time and then gets shaved off again, and that's the way that one works. Through Dallas Goldbug we get the idea that Alex Jones is really Bill Hicks, reincarnated. Morgan Freeman is supposed to be Jimi Hendrix under a new identity. Jimmy Carter is supposed to be JFK, who was never really assassinated. He just reinvented himself. Jim Morrison became Rush Limbaugh. What other ones do we get from Dallas Goldbug? He claims that Jordan Maxwell is actually the aforementioned William Cooper, who reinvented himself. And so we get many of these others. As far as I can see, there is no verifiable evidence to prove any of these things. They remain just speculation. And in the absence of any kind of evidence or proof, I have to question anyone that is putting out information like this and making out that it's the truth of a matter. It is personal opinion and nothing more. There's inherent truth in creation, and then there's personal opinion. And as we all well know, everybody's got a goddamn opinion. Opinions are like arseholes. Everyone's got one. Vanquish Man, on the email, got in touch to ask about... there is an artist who I love and who I do not associate with the Illuminati, but I have to say when I look at the artwork on Gary Newman's seminal album The Pleasure Principle from 1979 and the whole red glowing pyramid theme, It's right there. He says he found it laying about the photo studio and so used it, but I don't buy that explanation. Also, the rear cover of his Tubeway Army album Replicas has an interesting eyeball picture where his pupil is slanted and it smacks of Illuminati all-seeing eye symbolism to me. Was there a reason for that? Makes me think. Well, I've mentioned Gary Newman in some of my recent public talks, and he also crops up in a section of Musical Truth 2, the book. I think the fact that he was an early pioneer of synthesizer music, electronic music, and he popularised that whole thing at the end of the 70s, making way for the synth pop explosion of the 1980s, suggests that he may have been part of some agenda to get this kind of music popularised. And I find it very interesting that Gary Newman, Newman, was the name that he chose for himself, because the artist's real name was Gary Webb. But he invented himself as Gary Newman, and although he spells it N-U-M-A-N, I suspect that there are hints there of new man, as in one that has been augmented or upgraded, in the words of transhumanism, in the speak of these people, to something that is more than human, where a man, a human, has been merged with technology, with machinery, to become something more than they were before. I think Gary Newman's whole persona was getting everyone ready for the transhumanist agenda that was known to be coming in future years. And of course that's here in full flow now, where we're being entrained to think of everything digital, everything electronic, everything based around technology as being really great. And we have all this transhumanist doctrine from the likes of Ray Kurzweil and Elon Musk and all these other insane people trying to make us think that transhumanism is really great. It's not. It's a major threat to humanity. The major threat of our times, I would suggest. But I've mentioned that before. Okay, so let's move on to a question from Marcus Olofsson from Sweden. He asks, if we assume... All right, let me just check this is the correct question. Yes, it is. If we assume that one of the McCartneys, I knew a McCartney question would come up in this whole thing, was actually killed in 1966, not so sure of that because there's no verifiable evidence that Paul McCartney died in 1966, of course. It is a legend. There's plenty of symbolism to support the idea that he did, but there's actually no evidence. Anyway, he says, and one of the John Lennons, because he believes there was more than one John Lennon, could be, I guess, were killed in 1980. What about the murder attempt on George Harrison in 1999? This would mean that 3 of the members were murdered or were exposed to a murder attempt. From what I understand, he says, George Harrison survived the attack by sheer luck. He was stabbed 10 times. And there are also so many strange things surrounding that murder attempt. Absolutely. The attacker, Michael Abram, 34 at the time, had a history of psychiatric illness and was said to be a paranoid schizophrenic. He was acquitted of the murder charges due to insanity, and he was put in a mental asylum. This reeks of MK Ultra. Absolutely, it does. Just as with Mark Chapman and Sirhan Sirhan and John Hinckley Jr. and James Holmes and Adam Lanza, all these lone nut individuals that are blamed for all these shootings that we're having these days. Also, he goes on to say, George Harrison's home was said to have been one of Britain's best security systems, or had one of Britain's best security systems. But on that night, it failed. It's just like all the CCTV cameras that just happen to fail when there's one of these mass shootings at a public venue, right? That happens all the time. This would mean that the attacker had help from high places, which in turn begs the question from who and why. Yep, that's a good point and a good question. I don't really have any further insights into it other than to reiterate the points raised. Were all of the Beatles members meant to be sacrificed, and if so, why? He asked. Well, that is a possibility. As I mentioned, there is the idea that there was more than one John Lennon. There was certainly more than one Paul McCartney, and probably more than 2. As to whether a straight replacement was made, or we've had different individuals playing the public role of Paul McCartney paging in and out of the role all these years, that remains open to scrutiny, as so many things do. We can also factor Stuart Sutcliffe into all of this, of course, very much a forgotten member of the Beatles. He died in 1962 at the ripe old age of 21 from a reported brain hemorrhage. All kinds of stories surrounding that. He's supposed to have got into a fight in Hamburg when the Beatles were playing out there. He was beaten up by a bunch of thugs, and it's said that he was left with this brain damage that led to the hemorrhage. There's also a story about Stuart Sutcliffe getting into a fight with John Lennon. There's allegations that the two of them were involved in a homosexual affair. They had a fight, and it was that, according to Stuart Sutcliffe's own sister, actually, Paula, who put out a book a number of years ago. She claimed that her brother was involved in a gay relationship with John Lennon and that they'd had a fight, and that led to Stuart's brain aneurysm. Either way, it's very strange that he died at the age of 21 in 1962, just before the Beatles broke through to mass fame with Love Me Do. That was at the time that Pete Best was kicked out as the drummer and Ringo was brought in. Stuart tragically died. Paul McCartney takes over the playing of the bass. And the Beatles, as we know them, John, Paul, George and Ringo, are in place, ready for the explosion of Beatlemania at the tail end of 1962. There are many photographs of Stuart Sutcliffe flashing Masonic and Illuminati hand signs online, incidentally. You can get some of those, and that has to be telling in itself, right? Another question Marcus asks would be, how did Ringo escape? Was he servile and cooperative enough to have never been any threat? Well, Ringo did make the comment, people think it's Paul, but it's me. I'm the last surviving Beatle, in an interview that he did with the Daily Mail in 2010. That's an interesting statement to make, considering the person that we're asked to believe is the real Paul McCartney is still alive. Why did Ringo say, I'm the last remaining Beatle? And it's a shame that the interviewer didn't pick up on that. I would have loved to have heard the interviewer say, well, what do you mean by that, Ringo? Can you clarify that statement when Paul is out there alive? You know, what do you actually mean? But it was never picked up on. So my view is that Ringo has been servile, and Ringo has done everything that has been required of him. That would be one of the reasons why he picked up his knighthood earlier this year at the Palace. He's played the game. He's kept his mouth shut in most instances, with the odd exception, and he's been a good, obedient player. And I would suggest that's why Ringo's still around, whereas the others aren't. I often wonder also what Pete Best makes of all of this, because Pete Best is still alive. He's still out there somewhere. He must be looking on to all these conspiracy theories surrounding the Beatles and the replacement of McCartney. I wonder how much of the truth he knows, and I wonder what he makes of it all. I'd sure love him to do an interview and spill the beans. Well, there's still time for him to do it. Right, I've got a couple more. We're going to do two more before we wrap it up for this session. This question comes from Craig Morrison, and he says, I was very curious to know if you have anything on famous jazz artists such as Louis Armstrong or Miles Davis, Charles Mingus or Charlie Parker, etc. Knowing what we know about rock and roll, I bet there are dark sides to jazz as well, since it was a record industry. Still is, I guess. Also, I wonder if you could talk about Beck in a future show. I know he's a Scientologist and his mum hung out with Andy Warhol, but he makes such amazing music. Well, unfortunately, I don't know a whole lot about the jazz music scene. It's never really been my thing. I've not had time to dig into that whole music genre in a big way, so I've not uncovered a whole lot about it. That's not to say that I won't one day, because I seem to be going about things genre by genre, scene by scene, and I've no doubt, as you've alluded to there, that there is stuff to be uncovered with some of these hugely influential artists. I only really have one little snippet, which concerns Thelonious Monk, the jazz musician, and this cropped up in my first book, Musical Truth 1, and in it, what I had to say was, this wasn't the first time a black musician had embarked upon an affair with a Rothschild. I was talking about the rapper Jay Electronica and the strange relationship that he had with Kate Rothschild from that bloodline dynasty. As mentioned in an earlier chapter, jazz musician Thelonious Monk had been involved with a Rothschild baroness in the late 1950s, known as Nika. She was Monk's partner, and she was said to have been an obsessive jazz fan. Kate, meanwhile, this is Kate Rothschild going back to the J Electronica link, was a music producer among her various activities, running her Round Table, interesting name, record label. On the cover of the album Brilliant Corners by Thelonious Monk, there are 5 clones of Monk all pictured together as if in a kaleidoscopic mirror image. Could this be hinting at multiple personality disorder, bringing in mind control once again? So it is interesting, and it has to raise all kinds of alarm bells when you have a prominent jazz musician in a romantic relationship with a Rothschild heiress, given what that family is involved with and their role as key players in the control system that we have presiding over all these aspects of humanity today. As I say, I'm sure there's much more to know about the jazz scene, but that's the only bit I have at this stage. And when it comes to the musician Beck, again, don't really know the guy's music, not looked into him in a major way, but I've made a note to try and do that when I get some time. So thanks for that one. I'm going to make this the last question for this session then. We've been going for over an hour now. This one comes from, I don't actually have a name on it, but it was sent in by email anyway. And this person says, have there been any artists that you've mentioned in your books that have contacted you to basically say, you're talking shit and my mind is my own? Well, that is a good question. Nobody who is a major player from the industry, a household name, a recognised individual, has got in touch one way or the other to say, I've looked at your work, and either it's all a load of bollocks, you don't know what you're talking about, or absolutely you're on the right track. But I have had a great many lower level players from the industry. So this is artists that were very nearly signed to a major label, or artists and producers that had a small, moderate level of success, but never made it to household name status. And many of these people have got in touch to verify much of what I put out in the books and the public talks and say, you are actually on the right track. Absolutely. This stuff does go on. I've been in record company HQs. I've seen ritualistic occult activity. I've heard executives sitting around planning how they're going to change culture, planning how they're going to do social engineering, planning how they're going to create artificial scenes using Pied Pipers to lead the whole thing. So many people have offered some validation of those kinds of things. There is one very well-known music industry player. I'm not going to mention the guy's name because he doesn't want it put out there like that, and I want to protect his anonymity. But he got in touch with both Mike Williams, aka Sage of Quay, and myself earlier in the year to say that he'd come across the work of both of us, and he was knocked sideways by a lot of it because this was information that he had not been aware of before, but he's done a lot of his own research and he's discovered, to his great bemusement, that much of it does actually check out and that we are actually bringing some truth here. And he's also given me a few insights from his experience in the industry and added to a lot of this with some anecdotes, with some, validations of stuff that goes on. This guy, as I say, is extremely well known, but I'm not going to put his name out there. You'll just have to take my word for it if you choose to, that he's got in touch to offer, that confirmation. The only other major household name that I can mention would be Van Morrison. So Van Morrison is not someone that has directly got in touch with me one way or the other to respond to my work, but he did turn up to 2 of my public talks in 2016. He was in the audience when I did my presentation at the Glastonbury Symposium, came in and sat at the back, and then when I finished my talk, he just kind of slinked off again. And the organiser at the end of it came up to me and said, do you realise Van Morrison was there listening to your stuff? So God only knows what he made of it. God only knows what he was doing there, whether he was there on an individual basis. He was just personally curious as to what I was going to be saying, whether he was sent, whether he was representing some other kind of interest. I really don't know, but isn't it interesting that he was there at all? I can imagine he probably wouldn't have made much of one or two of the things that I had to say, particularly when I got into Bono and Bob Geldof, but it is what it is. The truth is the truth, and I don't make this shit up. I just report on what I find. I didn't put any of this stuff into place. None of what goes on in the music business happens because I want it to be that way, or because I or anyone else would ever have chosen for it to be that way. It is the way it is, and the job of onlookers, observers, and researchers such as myself and many other people doing this kind of work is to report on what we find and offer the validations and the citations and the confirmations of these things, so that we're not just spouting opinion again, but we're giving people some tangible information that actually checks out if you take the time and trouble to go and do the research with due diligence. All right, I think I'm about done. As I said, I'm not really one for videos. I normally sit behind a radio mic and I'm happier that way, but I hope people appreciate some of the stuff that's been raised in this video. I want to thank everyone that sent in questions. And I do plan to do this in the form of a live Facebook Q&A. As soon as I can figure out how to do it and get over my Luddite technophobic tendencies, I'll make that happen sooner rather than later. So hope you found this interesting. Once again, you can find all my work residing at markdevlin.co.uk. My YouTube channel is youtube.com/markdevlintv. And of course, all my podcasts, Good Vibrations, The Sound of Freedom, and a huge archive of my radio interviews are all on my Spreaker page. Just look for Mark Devlin on Spreaker. So thanks a lot for your attention. Hope I've not sent you to sleep. Catch you again next time. See you soon.